Hey there everyone, Indru here, and today we'll create this colorful and a fun Photoshop composition. We'll not only place things and color correct everything, but we'll also take a painterly approach and try to create a hand painted effect on the sky. I hope you like it, and if you do, please don't forget to like the video and feel very free to subscribe my channel if you're liking my content. That will mean a whole lot to me. Alright, but before getting started, I want to say something about the stock images. I generally tend to use free stock images from websites like Unsplash or Pexels so that you can also get them easily and add it to your projects. But over here in this composition, I really liked these images from Envato Elements and I used all of them from there only. So I'm sorry if you cannot get them because they are not free, but I'll put a link in the description so that you can go and check them out. So without further ado, let's get started. Here we are in Photoshop and I'll show you the image size. It's 2800 by 3500 pixels. It's 4:5 ratio so that it's easy to post in Instagram. So let's start with placing our very first image, and that is of the sky. Let's drop it in Photoshop and I'll adjust it a bit. I'll add a quick color cast with the selective color adjustment layer. I'll move to the cyan channel and I'll increase the magenta all the way to 100%. I'll also go to the blues and increase the cyan to around 20% and also magenta to around 20%. Next, I'll add the image of the clouds. Let's increase it to something like this. And I'll bring up the free transform tool by pressing Ctrl T or Command T on the keyboard. And then I'll hit perspective and I'll drag this node just to get this stretched out effect so that it looks like the bottom portion of the cloud is in front of us. Maybe I'll stretch it out a bit. Let's bring up our free transform tool again by pressing Ctrl T or Command T on the keyboard, and I'll right click and select perspective and I'll drag this node to stretch it out a bit. Maybe I'll take it down just like this. Let's hit the checkbox, and now I'll click this layer mask icon to get a layer mask on a layer, and I'll take the brush. I'll take this soft round brush, make sure your color is black and you are selecting the layer mask, and I'll paint to hide any unwanted areas of the sky other than the cloud. Now I'll add a quick brightness layer from this new adjustment layer icons. I'll select brightness and contrast and I'll increase the contrast to about +20, and I'll click this clipping mask icon so that the brightness and contrast layer icon only applies to the clouds and not to the sky layer below it. Now with that done, I'll quickly create some ambient light on the dark clouds at the center because we'll try to create an impression that the sunlight is coming from the very center. So let's create a new layer and I'll change its blending mode to lighten. I'll again take this soft round brush and I'll take a peach color. I can sample it from here. This should be okay. Maybe I'll reduce the opacity and the flow. I'm using square brackets on the keyboard to adjust the size of the brush, and I'll softly paint to get the desired effect. I'll create another layer below it by pressing Ctrl and then clicking this new layer icon. I'll change its blending mode to hard light, and then I'll take a color in the tone of yellow and I'll take a cloud brush and paint some highlight clouds on the distance. For this kind of brushes, you can check out brusheasy.com. You can get a whole lot of different types of brushes. I'll reduce opacity and flow a lot, and then I'll start painting on the horizon to have some nice yellow glow. Now with that done, I'll also create a new layer on top of everything, and I'll take a somewhat darker tone of the sky color and I'll paint on the top region so that we have somewhat darker shade of the sky on top and we have a nice gradient and our focus stays at the center of our image. Now with the top layer selected, I'll hold Shift on the keyboard and select the bottom layer. I'll press Ctrl G or Command G on the keyboard to group it. I'll rename it to Sky Backup, and then I'll press Ctrl G or Command G on the keyboard to duplicate it, and then I'll right click and select Merge Group to have a snapshot of the backdrop sky. Over here, we'll create some painterly effects. Let's go to the mixer brush tool and make sure the settings are like this. You have this button checked which says clean the brush after each stroke. Make sure this is not clicked, which says load the brush after each stroke. This should not be clicked. Only this one should be clicked, which says clean the brush after each stroke. Let's keep the default values of weight as 90%, load as 100%, mix as 35%, and flow at 100%. Now I'll zoom in a bit, and with the mixer brush selected, I can press square brackets on the keyboard to control the brush size, and I'll paint like this to create some painterly effects on the clouds and create some fluffy texture. Now this will take a whole lot of time, and if you also have a pen tablet at your hand, this will be very easy and fun to do, but I'll do it with mouse because I assume that most of you might not be having a pen tablet. So I'll spend some time over here and I'll fast forward, and I'll get back when it's done and I'm satisfied with the results. Make sure you are moving your mouse in circular motion just to create that fluffy cloud. This is simply an artistic choice. You can totally skip this one if you want to, but I thought this will create some nice painterly look on our composition. Well, this is what I ended up after spending almost 20 minutes. I'll convert this layer to Smart Object by right-clicking and selecting Convert to Smart Object, and then I'll apply a fill blur so that the distant clouds become a bit blurred out. So I'll put a pin over here, and maybe I'll keep it to 10, and I'll put another pin and I'll take it to 0. I'll create another pin in between and I'll take it to maybe 4, and I'll put it somewhere over there. This should be okay. And one more thing I'd love to do over here is that I'll create a new layer, and maybe I'll say Cloud Highlights, and I'll take a yellowish color like the center of the cloud, and I'll go to our normal brush tool and I'll select the soft round brush. I'll take the opacity down to around 20% and also flow to around 15%, and I'll paint some highlights on the cloud because the sunlight will be shining on top of that. Maybe increase the opacity a bit and also the flow. I'm simply moving the mouse in quick circular motion to create that fluffy nature of the cloud, and I'm just painting the highlights on top of these cloud fluffs. I'll again spend some time over here. I'll fast forward through this and I'll get back when it's done. Now that should be done. Let's again group up everything nice and tidy. Let's rename it to sky. I'll color code it to blue, and let's start placing our subject. So here goes our subject. Let's align it correctly. That should be okay. Now let's cut our subject. I'll use the pen tool and I'll again fast forward through this, and I'll get back when it's done. Now with that done, let's add some quick color grading. Let's create a brightness adjustment layer. I'll click this clipping mask icon, and then I'll take the contrast down to around -35. Then I'll create another exposure adjustment layer. Click this clipping mask icon and increase the gamma correction to around +0.85. Then I'll create another exposure layer and also click this clipping mask icon, and here also I'll take the gamma correction to about +0.95, and we'll decrease the exposure to around -85. We'll use the second exposure layer to create the dark areas on the subject and also add some basic highlights. So we'll quickly take the brush tool. We'll make sure the soft round pressure opacity and flow brush is selected. We'll reduce the opacity to around 25%, and we'll also reduce the flow to around 20%. And then make sure color black is selected as your foreground color, and then we'll paint off some areas where we think the highlight should be, because this is a dark exposure layer, and if we paint on the layer mask with black, it should hide that darkness and reveal some of the light areas. Maybe we can increase the opacity a bit. These should be the areas where it should get some light. You can press X on the keyboard to switch between the black and white colors, and you can paint again with white to darken it up. Once done, we'll create a selective color adjustment layer and we'll drag it just above the subject and below the brightness and contrast. Make sure it's clipped and all the other layers on top of it are also clipped. So go to the whites channel over here and increase the values like this. Magenta to around plus 23, yellow to around plus 10, and blacks to around plus 15. Then I'll go to the blacks channel, I'll increase the yellow to around plus 6 and I'll decrease the black to around minus 15. With that done, I'll quickly place some wings on our car. I'll select the top layer and bring in our aeroplane to cut the wings out of it. I'll first align it so that the angle of the wings fit correctly with the angle of the car. Once I'm satisfied with the size, I'll quickly cut out the two wings using pen tool. Once the selection for one wing is done, I'll simply right click and select layer via copy. I'll again select the main image and use the pen tool to cut out the other wing. I'll delete the original copy and let's rename this as wing 1 and this one as wing 2. They should go below our car. This windscreen should be transparent a bit, so let's select the layer mask. Let's take a brush and let's reduce the opacity a bit. Let's zoom in and we'll brush away some parts from here to make this windscreen a bit transparent. That should be it. Let's try to match the wings color with the color of the car. So let's select the wing and let's create a selective color adjustment layer. I'll click this button to clip it to the layer mask. Let's go to the reds channel. I think it should have some boosted cyans. Okay, now it's time to place the Falcon. Let's drop the image onto our canvas and we'll take it down below our subject and let's try to position it properly. And let's cut it out. Let's again use the pen tool to cut it out cleanly. Alright, with the selection done, we have a little problem over here. So you can see there is a bit of shadow because the light was coming from the front for this Falcon, but in our composition we have the light coming from the back. So we have to remove this shadow. Let's do that. I'll rasterize the layer and I'll apply the layer mask so that it reduces the size a bit because the image was pretty large. I'll duplicate it just to keep a backup and I'll use the clone stamp tool to sample different areas of the feathers and put it over there. I'll also occasionally use the brush tool to normally paint some colors where it's difficult to sample with the clone stamp tool. I'm doing it pretty quickly over here, but if you get some stuff like this to do, please spend as much time as you can to do it correctly. So it looks more or less fine to me. I'll add a quick color cast on the Falcon by creating a solid color fill layer. I'll take some peach color, change the blending mode to lighten and decrease the fill percentage to around 25%. Then I'll also create an exposure adjustment layer. Clip it by clicking this clipping mask icon. I'll increase the gamma correction to around 0.92 and decrease the exposure to around minus 0.33. Before moving any further, I'll quickly add two color lookup tables to dramatically change the color profile of our composition. Let's go to the new adjustment layer icon and select color lookup. I'll select crisp warm color lookup and decrease the fill to around 60%. And I'll again go to the new adjustment layer icon and select color lookup. This time I'll click this third drop down menu and select red, blue, yellow, and I'll decrease the fill percentage to around 50%. It looks pretty nice, right? Now let's add all our other elements very quickly. Let's pop in this fireworks rocket. Let's quickly create a layer mask and take a brush. Let's take a hard round brush and with the black color selected, we'll quickly paint over this layer mask to get rid of the rocket itself. Let's increase the opacity and we'll keep the fire trail behind. We'll also change the blending mode to screen. And now let's bring up our free transform tool by pressing Ctrl T or Command T on the keyboard. And let's place it correctly with the bottle. I'll quickly rasterize the layer and I'll apply the layer mask because I'll be applying some warp to this shape. Let's bring up our free transform tool by pressing Ctrl T or Command T on the keyboard. Let's right click and select warp. Let's warp it a bit just to give it a curve so that it looks a bit more natural. Let's drag it into position. Maybe I'll need to erase a few more parts of it. Let's create a layer mask, and with the brush and color black, I'll brush away all unwanted areas. I think this will need an exposure treatment. Let's create a new exposure layer. Let's clip it to the fire trail layer and let's increase the gamma correction to around 0.65. This should be good. I tend to color code all layers so that I don't lose track of them. So I'll do the same over here. Next, let's put our moon. I'll drop in our moon image, rotate and resize it to position, change the blending mode to screen, and that should be good. Now let's create some meteors. I'll bring in this image and I'll change the blending mode to lighten. I'll position it properly and then I'll apply some warp to it so that I can increase the comet trail a bit. I just pressed Ctrl T or Command T on the keyboard to bring up my free transform tool. I went into the warp and just dragged it a bit, just like this. Maybe I'll rasterize the layer and hold Alt or Option on the keyboard and click this layer mask icon to create an inverted layer mask. Then I'll take a soft round brush and take color white as my foreground color and paint to reveal only the comet and get rid of the unwanted areas. I think we can also right click and go to the blending options and play with this layer slider black node to separate the black areas a bit more precisely. That should be okay. And let's duplicate this one and scale it a bit to create more comets on our composition. We can place one over here as well, and this should be fine. Let's add some smoke trail on our wings. For that, I'll use this image of the jet trail. Let's first rasterize the layer by right clicking and selecting rasterize layer. I'll quickly create a layer mask and I'll try to get rid of one of the trails because we'll only have a single trail. For that, let's select the layer mask, make sure our foreground color is black, and let's brush away the unwanted areas. With that done, let's change the blending mode to screen. And we can also go inside this blending options by right clicking and going to blending options and play with this layer slider to separate those dark blue areas properly. You see, the blue areas are completely gone and we're left with this white trail. I'll keep a backup and I'll duplicate it and try to place and align it to the wings. Maybe I'll also try to apply a warp transform just like before to give it a more curved shape. That should be good. Let's press Ctrl G or Command J to duplicate it and take it to the other wing. I'm again warping and squeezing it a bit because I think it's at a distance, so it should be a bit thinner. Now this is again a purely artistic choice. I'm taking this smudge tool, I'm reducing the strength to around 50%. I'm taking a soft round brush and I'll simply wiggle a bit to give it a more natural look. Make sure sample all layers is not checked and let's wiggle a bit just like this. Maybe we can reduce the strength a bit. Let's do the same for the other trail. Now that should be done and we can start adding the highlights. For that, I'll group the entire subject of the child flying the car together by holding Shift and clicking the top and the bottom layer and then press Ctrl G or Command G to group it. Let's rename it to subject. Now I'll create a solid color layer. I'll take a dark yellow color for the highlights. I'll change the blending mode to linear dodge. Then I'll select the layer mask and press Ctrl I or Command I to invert it. Now let's take a soft round brush, reduce the opacity and the flow, and with color white selected as the foreground color, I'll paint the areas where I think the highlight should be. But before that, I'll right click and select create clipping mask so that the highlights layer only clips to the subject folder, and let's start painting the highlights. Like I say in most of my videos, I have a dedicated video on how to do highlights and shadows. You can check it out. The video link should be in the description section. Maybe I'll also drop these Falcon layers into the group so that I can paint the highlights on them as well. Again, here as well, I'm doing it pretty quickly. You should take as much time as you can to do it correctly. Now let's create some more layers to make the glow on the headlights. I'll create another solid color fill in the shade of yellow. Change the blending mode to linear dodge. Select the layer mask and press Ctrl+I or Command+I to invert it. Now let's zoom in and let's paint some lights with white on the layer mask. I'll switch to color black and paint off any unwanted areas. And let's reduce the fill to around 65%. I'll create another solid color fill in the same shade of yellow. Change the blending mode to linear dodge. Click the layer mask and press Ctrl+I or Command+I to invert it. This time I'll select the soft round brush. Let's reduce the opacity and flow. I'll increase the brush size, and with color white as the foreground color, I'll paint on the layer mask to add some glow that is coming off of the headlights. I'll also paint on the same layer to add some ambient glow which is coming from the exhaust fire. Now let's add some particles and some sparks. Let's bring in this image, change the blending mode to screen, position it correctly. I'll add an inverted layer mask by holding Alt or Option on the keyboard and clicking this layer mask icon to fill it with all black. And then I'll select this soft round brush, and with color white as my foreground color, I'll paint in some of the sparks over here. If it's too much, I can always switch the colors to black by pressing X on the keyboard and paint away any unwanted areas. Now this should be okay. I'll bring in again this same sparks layer and I'll add some sparks on the foreground. Let's again change the blending mode to screen, and this looks kind of fine to me. Let's again add a layer mask, and with color black as the foreground color, this time I'll hide away any unwanted areas. I'll resize it a bit, just like this, and they should be okay. And I'll again use the same sparks layer to add some particles on the sky. I'll rasterize by right clicking and selecting rasterize layer. I'll change the blending mode to screen. I'll press Ctrl+Shift+U or Command+Shift+U to desaturate it. And then I'll right click and go to blending options, and I'll move this black node from this layer slider so that it gets rid of all the black color. And I'll position it correctly. I'll resize it a bit and maybe reduce the fill just to give a hint of the particles. And I can also add a layer mask, and with black I can paint away any unwanted areas. So that looks good to me. I'll simply add an overall curves adjustment layer to boost the contrast a bit. I'll simply draw an S curve in this RGB channel, and that should be all. But before finishing, again, I think we can add a little bit of blur on the tip of the wings of this Falcon. So let's select the Falcon layer and then go to filter, blur gallery, filled blur, and then we can keep adding the pins. I'll add one pin on the Falcon's head and reduce the blur percentage to 0 pixels, and then I'll put one blur at the tip of the wingtip and maybe add a blur of 5 pixels, and do the same for the other wingtip, add a blur of 5 pixels, and then I'll add some more pins and take the blur to 0 so that it does not have any blur at the body. Let's do the same for the tail. Maybe I'll add 1 pixel over here and maybe 3 pixels on the tip of the tail. Let's click OK. This looks fine to me. As I was showing you things very quickly in this short video, I spent some more time off screen to shift the layers here and there a bit, and also spend a whole lot of time to paint the highlights correctly. So this is the final result, and I really hope you will like it. If you do, please don't forget to like the video and let me know in the comments below what you think of this. And if you're liking my content, then please subscribe to the channel. It will be really wonderful of you. Well then, I'll see you in my next video, and till then, enjoy creating.